Edith Colfax stood in the middle of Cravenhall's great hall, her hands folded over her mended apron, when Simon Draycott raised his silver cup and called for silence with a gesture the whole room obeyed at once. "Before we drink further to the health of these two young people," he said, and his voice filled every corner of the hall as though he had been born to command it, "there is a matter of honor we ought to settle here, before all these witnesses." Joan, seated beside Hugh with her cheeks still flushed from the feasting, reached for her mother's hand beneath the table. Edith did not move. "The dowry the miller's widow offers for this match," Simon went on, letting his gaze travel the hall as a man displays a jewel, "is, let us be charitable, modest. Insufficient, I should say, for the name my son would give her." He laughed, and several of his guests laughed with him, though not all. "So I propose this, that Mistress Edith double the dowry before the wedding, or that the girl go back to the mill with her mother, where she will no doubt be more comfortable." The silence that followed had the weight of ice. Simon let his eyes drop to Edith's gown, mended with such care the stitches formed almost a pattern, and smiled as though he had found the final proof of his argument. "Look at her," he said, gesturing with his cup. "She cannot even dress herself fit for this table. What dowry can such a woman offer?" The whole hall laughed. Edith felt each laugh land like a separate stone, but she did not lower her eyes, did not look for the door, did not say a word. To know how this story ends, how a widow with nothing but her own work-worn hands brought a man like that to his knees before the truth, you must know Edith from the beginning, months before that night, when she still believed that dignity alone could shield her from the world. Before we continue with this story, tell us in the comments, where are you watching this video from? We're always glad to know how far this story has traveled. To understand how we came to stand in that hall, we must go back some months, to a day when Edith still ground wheat more in memory than with her hands, for the old mill had stood silent 3 years, and she earned her bread mending and sewing for the houses of Hartwell that would allow it. The Colfax mill rose on the river bank, its will unmoving since Wilfred, Edith's husband, had died one winter night, worn through by years of labor without rest so that his family would never know the shame of owing anyone anything. Edith remembered that night with a clarity that still hurt, the cold that had crept into her bones while she waited for word, the way the village leech had lowered his eyes before he spoke, the way the mill wheel kept turning for hours after Wilfred's heart had already stopped, as though it did not know its master was gone. Since then, Edith had raised Joan alone on what her hands could sew, mend, and embroider. She asked no charity. She accepted none she had not earned in kind. When the women of the village offered her extra bread because, Edith, just take it, she always found something to give in return, an urgent scene, a perfect mend, a word of counsel about herbs for a fever. Her pride was not vanity. It was the one thing that remained whole. Joan had grown up watching her mother work from dawn to dusk without complaint, and so, when Hugh Draycott began seeking her out at the market cross, with more shyness than arrogance despite the name he carried, Edith did not object. Hugh did not resemble his father. He had the eyes of someone who had not yet learned to look down on others, and he treated Joan with a tenderness Edith recognized, for it was the same tenderness Wilfred had once shown her. The first time Edith saw Hugh up close was a market Thursday, when the young man stopped at her sewing stall with the excuse of a doublet needing a mended sleeve. She knew, from the way his eyes searched for Joan among the crowd without daring to meet hers directly, that the boy had not come for the doublet. She said nothing. She only stitched with small, careful stitches, and watched Joan, pretending not to notice, smile anyway. "He's a good lad," she told her neighbor Alice that evening, sharing a little broth by the fire. "But he's his father's son. And that weighs on a match, Alice. It always weighs." "The name weighs, Edith, not the heart," Alice answered. She had been widowed the same winter and knew better than anyone what it cost to keep a house without a man. And that girl's heart has already chosen. You can only give her your blessing or your fear. There's no third road worth taking. Edith kept silent, for she knew her friend spoke true, though some part of her, the part that had buried a husband worn down by other men's debts, could not stop wondering what price, in the end, kinship with the Draycotts would carry. Simon Draycott had built his fortune with the same grim determination other men bring to raising cathedrals, stone by stone, year upon year, without rest and without pity for whoever stood in his way. The new mill, with its great wheel and its mechanism brought at cost from across the sea, ground more grain in a day than the old Colfax mill could in a week. The wool warehouse rising beside the river, packed with fleece bound for the spring fairs, was the pride of the whole shire. Few knew, and Simon preferred it stay so, that his own grandfather had come to these parts a bondsman fleeing another lord's manor, with nothing but the clothes on his back, and that it was the charity of a man named Godwin Colfax, Joan's great-grandfather, though no Draycott ever spoke that name aloud, that had let him settle along the river and begin again. Simon hated to remember it. Every coin he earned, every chair he had upholstered in fine cloth, every guest who bowed before him at market, was another stone laid over the grave of that humble beginning he feared someone, someday, might dig up. That was why, when his son Hugh spoke of marrying the miller's widow's daughter, Simon felt something close to panic, though he dressed it as indignation. A miller's daughter, he had said, the first time Hugh mentioned Joan. My son, we have worked our whole lives so our name might sit beside the finest families of this shire. And you would join us to a woman who mends her own gown? Hugh had pressed the matter, with the same quiet stubbornness he had inherited from his late mother and not from his father, and in the end Simon had yielded, but with a condition he kept to himself: he would turn the betrothal into a public display of his own superiority. If he could not stop the match, he would at least see to it that the whole village understood who was doing whom a favor. Simon carried, too, a darker reason he scarcely admitted even to himself. The larger his fortune grew, the more he feared that someone, someday, might dare ask where the Millhurst croft had truly come from. There were men in the shire, old men, most of them, with long memories, who still recalled his grandfather arriving with nothing but a borrowed cart and empty hands. Simon had spent half his life buying silence with calculated charity, a new well for the parish, generous alms at the harvest feast, gifts to the almshouse for wandering pilgrims. Every public act of charity was, at bottom, a coin paid against the fear of being remembered as what his family truly had been, nothing at all. Hugh, growing up, had inherited only a small part of that legacy of fear dressed as pride. He remembered his mother, faintly now, as a woman who laughed easily and treated the manor servants with the same courtesy she showed noble guests, and that memory, however faded by the years, had left in him a seed of kindness his father had never quite managed to smother, for all the sermons on family honor he had preached over the years. The betrothal feast was held on a Sunday at summer's end, the tables laid in Cravenhall's great hall with more finery than Joan had ever seen in her life. Edith came in the only good gown she had left, mended with such care that only a trained eye would have noticed the stitches, and with her head held high, for she had decided, before crossing the threshold, that no rich man would make her feel less than what she was. All passed with the tense courtesy of such occasions until Simon rose, cup in hand, and spoke the words we already know: the demand for the doubled dowry, the mockery of the mended gown, the laughter that filled the hall like cold water. Edith did not weep. She did not beg. She looked Simon in the eye for a moment that felt longer to him than was comfortable, and then, in a steady voice, said, "My daughter needs no shouting from me to defend her, Simon Draycott. Her honor stands untouched, whatever comes of this night." She turned to Joan, whose eyes brimmed with tears held back. "Come, daughter." They left before the sweet course, amid murmurs Edith pretended not to hear. Hugh tried to follow, but his father caught his shoulder with a firm hand, and the last sight Edith carried from that hall was Simon, smiling in satisfaction, like a man who has won a game without effort. Crossing the yard toward the gate, Edith still caught voices behind her, someone arguing low that the demand was fair enough. "Look how she's dressed," another voice, older, muttering that, "In my day we did not treat an honest widow so, but no one respects anything anymore." She knew that second voice. It was Father Osric, the manor's priest, who caught her eye for an instant with something like shame of his own, as though he felt he should have spoken louder, said something everyone could hear. "Mistress Edith," he said, catching up with her at the door, "God keep you this night. And if you have need of someone outside this house to talk to, my door stands open." Edith only nodded, unable to trust her own voice, and walked on into the night with Joan clinging to her arm. Above them the sky was clear and full of stars, indifferent to the small cruelty just done inside that lit hall, and it was that very indifference, Edith thought as she walked, that gave her some strange comfort. The world kept turning regardless, the stars kept their silent course, and nothing Simon Draycott had said that evening could truly change who she was beneath the mended gown and beneath the eyes that judged her. That night, after Joan had cried herself to sleep, Edith took out her late father's small chest again. She had inherited it barely opened, in the confused months after his death, when burying a father and holding a household together at once had left no time for curiosities of the past. Now, 20 years later, she loosened the dried leather cord with fingers that trembled a little, more from the weight of the night than from any effort. She read the worn parchment again, more carefully this time, drawing the candle close enough to nearly scorch the paper's edge. The words "time" had not quite erased formed an incomplete phrase, "grant of the lands of Millhurst Croft, given out of Christian charity to." The name that followed was stained with old damp, unreadable. But lower, in a different, smaller hand, someone had noted something about yearly rent of 1 flitch of bacon, payable at Michaelmas, so long as the useful right be maintained. Edith sat still, the parchment trembling faintly in the candlelight, feeling a piece of her life she had never known was missing suddenly fall into place. Millhurst Croft. She had heard that name before, years ago, from an old neighbor now long dead, who used to say that the land under the Draycotts' new mill was, in another time, someone else's land. She had never thought much of it. Now, with the parchment trembling faintly in the candlelight, she understood that Millhurst Croft was, exactly, the ground on which the new mill and the wool warehouse now stood, the very source of the fortune Simon had paraded that same night as a weapon against her. She did not yet know what it meant. She did not know whether the paper held any weight in law, whether the flitch had ever truly been paid, or whether this was only the faded memory of an agreement between men 20 years in their graves. But she felt, for the first time since Wilfred's death, that she was not entirely without defense. She put the parchment back in the chest, careful this time to mark exactly where she laid it, and blew out the candle with her heart beating as it had not in years. Simon Draycott's grief for his late wife had never quite healed into peace. Maud had been the one soul who ever heard him confess his fear plainly, one winter night much like the one that had taken Wilfred Colfax at the old mill. "I fear, Maud, that all this will melt away like snow one day, and I'll be nothing again, same as I was." "Then don't build your life on fear, Simon," she had told him. "Build it on gratitude for the man who helped you start with something. The day you forget that gratitude will be the day you truly lose everything." He had promised her that night, holding her hand by the fire, that he would settle the old debt properly before it became someone else's burden to carry. It was a promise he meant sincerely in the moment he made it, and one he found 100 small reasons to postpone in every year that followed, until postponement itself had hardened into something closer to refusal. Simon had never followed that counsel. After Maud's death, gratitude had slowly curdled into shame, and shame, as it always does in men who will not face it, had hardened into contempt for anyone whose very existence reminded him where his family had come from. If you have ever felt the world laugh at you for not having enough, if you have ever been judged by a mended dress instead of the honest work behind every stitch, then you already know something of the pain Edith carried that night on the road home. We know what it is to swallow humiliation in silence, because crying out would only give the one who wronged us the satisfaction of seeing us break. But stay with this story a little longer, because the justice that seems impossible sometimes does not live in any register or roll, it lives in the very house of the one who wronged you, waiting for someone inside those walls to find the courage to open a locked box. Edith did not know it yet, but the truth she needed was not hers to find at all. It belonged to someone else entirely. In the days after the feast, Edith turned the fragment of parchment over in her mind again and again, but there was no clerk to consult, no register kept anywhere she could reach. Her father, it seemed, had never trusted the promise to any hand but his own memory, and had written it down only for himself, in case age ever stole what he knew. She spoke of it to no one but Alice, who listened with her usual mixture of sympathy and caution. A memory and half a sentence on old parchment, Edith. It's little enough to stand against a man like Simon Draycott. It is what I have, Edith answered. And I have learned that little enough has carried me through worse winters than this one. Alice reached over and squeezed her hand. Do you remember the winter after Wilfred died, when the granary flooded and half the village thought you'd have to sell the mill outright? You had nothing then either, and you found a way. I had you, and a strong back, and more pride than sense, Edith said, with the ghost of a smile. I don't know that pride alone will serve this time. This time it isn't only my back that needs carrying, it's Joan's whole future. Then we'll hope pride brings good company this time too, Alice answered, and left her with that small, uncertain comfort as the evening drew on. Edith spent the following days as she had always spent hard days, with work, since idle hands left too much room for despair to creep in. She took an extra mending from 3 houses at once, staying up past the last candle stub some nights, less for the coin than for the simple mercy of exhaustion, which let her sleep without dwelling too long on what the coming weeks might bring. What Edith did not know, could not have known, was that on the very night of the feast, in the Draycott Manor house across the river, her daughter's intended husband had come home from Cravenhall with a coldness in his chest that would not let him sleep. Hugh Draycott lay awake long after the household had gone quiet, turning over in his mind his father's cruelty at the feast, the mended gown Simon had mocked, the way Joan's eyes had brimmed with tears she refused to let fall. He thought, too, of his mother, dead these 8 years, and of how ashamed she would have been to see her husband's contempt worn so openly, like a fine coat. Unable to lie still, he rose before dawn and made his way to the small chamber at the top of the east tower that had been his mother's solar, left mostly untouched since her death save for occasional dusting by a servant too fond of Maud's memory to let the room fall to ruin. He went there sometimes still, when his father's temper grew too heavy to bear, simply to sit among what remained of her, a comb, a shawl, a few books she had loved. That morning, reaching behind a shelf for a candle stub he remembered keeping there as a boy, his hand struck something hard and cold, a small iron-bound strongbox, pushed far back into the shadow, locked, and thick with the dust of years untouched. He sat with the box a long while before touching the lock, turning it over in his hands, feeling the years of dust catch on his sleeve. He thought of the last time he had seen his mother, thin and fevered in her curtained bed, speaking words he had been too young and too frightened to hold onto properly. He had always regretted that grief and youth had robbed him of whatever last wisdom she had meant to leave him. Perhaps, he thought, some of it had been left another way, in ink instead of breath. He knew, the moment he found it, that it was not his to open. And he knew, in the same breath, that he was going to open it anyway. The lock was old and stubborn, but Hugh was patient, and by mid-morning he had worked it free with a bent nail and more determination than skill. Inside lay a modest bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, a woman's small prayer book, and a folded document sealed with a signet Hugh recognized at once as his mother's own. The prayer book fell open, from long use, to a page marked with a pressed and long-faded flower, beside a psalm about the faithfulness of God to those who kept their word. Hugh set it aside gently, feeling already, before he had read a single letter, that he was trespassing on something private in a way that went beyond mere disobedience to his father's wishes. He read the letters first, mostly ordinary things, correspondence between Maud and her own mother before her marriage, notes of small domestic matters. But near the bottom of the bundle, in his mother's careful hand, he found a letter that had never been sent, addressed to no one, as though she had written it only to settle her own conscience. I have asked Simon 3 times now to make right the debt his grandfather left unpaid to the Colfax family, it read, and 3 times he has told me it is an old man's matter, long forgotten, not worth troubling over. I do not think he believes this. I think he is afraid of what it would cost his pride to admit what his family truly owes. I have made him promise, before God and before me, that he will settle it properly before Hugh comes of age to marry, so that our son does not carry into his own household a debt his father was too proud to pay. I pray he keeps that promise. I fear, in my heart, that he will not. Hugh sat with the letter a long while, the morning light shifting slowly across the floor, before he understood the full weight of what he was holding, not merely an old grievance, but his own mother's dying wish, made in broken years before he was old enough to know either had happened. Beneath the letter lay one more thing, a small, faded drawing, done in a child's clumsy hand, of a mill wheel beside a river, with 2 names written beneath it in his mother's careful script, Colfax and Draycott, joined by a small drawn heart, as though even as a girl, before she had married into the family that would come to fear its own history, Maud had understood something about the 2 families' fates being tied together that her husband had spent a lifetime trying to forget. He turned the drawing over twice, as though a second look might explain it, but found only his mother's initials on the back, and a date some 40 years past, long before Maud had ever become a Draycott, when she had perhaps been nothing more than a Colfax neighbor's child, sketching a future she could not have known would one day be hers to protect. He read the unsent letter a second time, and then a third, memorizing its shape until he could nearly recite it, as though repetition might make its contents less impossible to carry alone. Somewhere in the manor below, he could hear the ordinary sounds of the household going about its morning, a servant scolding a hound, the clatter of the kitchen fire being built up, utterly unaware that the small tower room above them held a secret that could unmake the peace of the whole house. He did not yet know what to do with what he had found. Some part of him, the part that still flinched at his father's temper even as a grown man, wanted to put the letter back, lock the box, and pretend the tower room held nothing but dust in memory. But a larger part of him, the part Joan's tears at the feast had cracked open, could not stop hearing his mother's voice in those written words, asking a promise of a man who had already, it seemed, decided to break it. He sought out old Nan that same afternoon, Agnes Marrow, who had nursed both himself and, years before that, his own mother as a girl, and who now lived out her days in a small cottage near the mill, kept comfortable by a pension Maud herself had arranged before her death. Nan, he said, sitting across from her at her small hearth, the letter folded in his sleeve, did my mother ever speak to you of a debt my father owed the Colfax family? The old woman's hands stilled over her mending, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, which told Hugh more than words might have. She spoke of it at the end, Master Hugh. In her last days, when the fever had her mostly, but not always. Old Nan's eyes grew distant, remembering. She made me promise to remind your father of it, if ever I found the courage. I never did find it. I was afraid of losing my place, and ashamed of myself for the fear. Hugh felt something settle in his chest, heavy and certain. You will not need to find that courage alone, Nan. I have found some of my own, it seems, and I mean to use it. Careful how you use it, Master Hugh, Nan warned, though her eyes were bright with something like pride beneath the caution. Your father is not a man who takes well to being cornered. Whatever you mean to do it where he cannot simply shout you both into silence and lock the door after. I mean to do it where the whole shire can hear him try, Hugh said, and found, saying it aloud, that the plan had already half formed itself in his mind without his quite noticing. Old Nan was quiet a long moment, her weathered hands still in her lap, before she spoke again. There's more, Master Hugh, if you want to hear the whole of it. Your mother asked me, near the very end, to make sure that whoever you married one day, it wouldn't be a match built on the same silence that near broke her heart. I didn't understand then how I'd ever manage such a promise. I think, perhaps, I've only just managed it, and 8 years late at that. Old Nan's eyes filled, and she set down her mending entirely. Your mother used to say you had her stubbornness and your father's patience, Master Hugh, and that the day those two things met properly in you, you'd be a better man than either of your parents managed to be alone. I begin to think she was right, though I confess I never expected to see it proven quite so soon. Hugh sat with that a long moment, turning the words over. I wish I had known she was fighting that battle at all. I always thought her sadness in those last years was only the fever taking her strength. Fevers and grief wear similar faces sometimes, Master Hugh. It is not always easy to tell which is stealing a person away. What was she like, Nan? Truly, I mean. I have only a boy's memory of her, and it grows dimmer every year. The old woman smiled, a little sadly. She was kind in a way that cost her something, Master Hugh, not the easy kindness of a woman with nothing to lose, but the harder kind, the kind that keeps giving even when it isn't returned. She loved your father, God knows, more than he ever deserved, and it grieved her something terrible that she could never quite soften the part of him that feared his own shadow. I think, in the end, she hoped you might do what she couldn't. That evening, Joan came to mind, still shaken from the day's discovery, and with her the memory of her mother's steady, unbroken dignity at the feast, and Hugh understood, with a clarity that frightened him, that he could no longer simply watch his father wrong that family and say nothing. He walked down to the river after leaving old Nan's cottage, following the same path he had walked 100 times as a boy, and stood along while watching the water move past in the dusk, thinking of how strange it was that the very ground beneath his feet, Millhurst Croft, his father's pride and his mother's shame, belonged, by every measure of honesty he now understood, to the family he had been forbidden to properly love. He resolved, standing there, that whatever came of the letters, he would not be the second generation of Draycotts to let his own children inherit a lie. Simon Draycott noticed his son's strange mood before he understood its cause. Hugh had always been quiet, but this was a different quiet, watchful, troubled, the quiet of a man carrying something he had not yet decided what to do with. It was the missing key that gave the game away. Simon kept a spare to his late wife's old strongbox in his own counting house, out of habit more than purpose, and one evening, moving papers, he noticed the box's usual place on the shelf disturbed, a thin line in the dust where it had been shifted and returned not quite straight. He said nothing to Hugh directly. Instead, that same night, he rode to the tower room himself, found the strongbox, tried the lock, and found it already broken. Inside, he found the letters disturbed, out of their original order, enough to tell him that someone had read what he had spent 8 years hoping no one would ever find. He did not need to ask who. He stood in the tower room alone while, after making his discovery, the broken lock cold in his hand, feeling something he had not felt in years, not merely anger, but a kind of grief, sharp and unexpected, for the wife who had trusted him with a promise he had spent 8 years finding reasons not to keep. He thought of burning the letters then and there, of ending the matter before it could ever reach Hugh's lips in anger. But some old fear of Maud's memory, of what she would have thought of him, doing such a thing in the very room that had been hers, stayed his hand, and he only locked the box again, more carefully this time, and carried it himself down to his counting house before dawn. The confrontation came the next morning, in Simon's own study, with the door shut against servants' ears. "You had no right," Simon said, his voice low and dangerous in a way Hugh had rarely heard directed at himself. "Whatever you found in your mother's things is a private matter, not yours to judge. She wrote that you promised her, Father, before God, that you would settle the debt before I married." Hugh's voice shook, but he did not look away. "Were you ever going to keep that promise? Or did you mean to let her die believing a lie?" Simon's face went through something complicated, grief, and shame, and beneath both, the old cold fear that had ruled him since boyhood. "You do not understand what you are asking me to give up. Everything I built so that no Draycott would ever again be looked at the way my grandfather was looked at, arriving in this shire with nothing but the rags on his back and a stranger's charity keeping him from starving in a ditch. I understand that you are asking me to marry into a family you have wronged, and to let my own children grow up not knowing what their grandfather did," Hugh answered. "I will not do it,
father. Not in silence. Simon's response was not what Hugh expected. He did not shout, did not strike the table as he so often did when crossed. He simply grew very still, and very cold, and said, "Then perhaps it is time you spent some months with your uncle in the north, away from this match and this foolishness, until you remember where your loyalty belongs." It was, Hugh understood at once, both a threat and a sentence: exile disguised as family visiting, meant to separate him from Joan long enough for the betrothal to collapse on its own, and to remove him from the letters, which Simon lost no time locking away again, this time in his own counting house, behind a door only he held the key to. "You would send me away rather than answer for what you've done," Hugh said, still standing at the study door, refusing to be dismissed so easily. "I would keep this family whole rather than watch my own son tear it apart over a debt older than either of us," Simon answered, and for a moment something almost like pleading crossed his face. "You do not understand, Hugh. A man builds a name over a lifetime, stone by stone, and it takes only a single afternoon of truth-telling to knock the whole of it down. I have spent 40 years making sure no one in this shire looks at me and sees a beggar's grandson. I will not undo that with my own hand." "Then I will undo it with mine," Hugh said quietly, and left before his father could answer. Hugh spent that day in a fog of helpless fury, watched by servants his father had clearly set to keep an eye on him, unable to reach either the letters or Joan without his father's knowledge. He tried, twice, to slip past the stable boy station conspicuously near the gate, and twice was met with an apologetic but immovable "Master says you're not to ride out today, sir," delivered by a young groom who plainly wanted no part of the family quarrel but wanted his position even less. By evening, Hugh had half convinced himself the whole plan was lost, that his father's exile threat would stand, that the letters would remain locked away, that Joan would spend the rest of her days believing he had simply abandoned her without explanation. It was old Nan, again, who found a way through. "There's a loose board in the counting house floor, Master Hugh," she told him quietly that evening, having slipped past the watching servants with an old woman's practiced invisibility. "Your mother showed it to me once, years ago, laughing, saying it was where she hid sweets from your father when they were newly wed. It sits beneath the shelf where he keeps his strong boxes." That night, with the household finally asleep and Michaelmas only a day off, Hugh crept to the counting house with old Nan keeping watch at the stair, pried up the loose board with a knife blade, and found, in the narrow space beneath, not a hiding place for the strongbox itself, but a gap just wide enough to reach up and unseat the lock's back plate from underneath, a trick, old Nan later admitted with a small, proud smile, that Maud herself had shown her husband's clumsy locksmith how to defeat, in a fit of newlywed mischief neither of them had ever imagined would matter so much, years later. The counting house was silent save for the creak of old floorboards and Hugh's own careful breathing. Twice he froze, certain he had heard his father's tread on the stair outside, only for the sound to pass on toward the kitchen and away again. His hands, when he finally worked the lock free from beneath, were slick with sweat despite the autumn chill, and it took 3 attempts before the mechanism gave with a soft, terrible click that seemed, in the silence, loud enough to wake the whole household. It did not. The letters were his again before the sky began to lighten, and old Nan, waiting at the foot of the stair with a lit taper cupped against the wind, allowed herself a single relieved breath before hurrying him toward the stable. "Ride fast, Master Hugh, and don't look back to see if he's watching. A man who's afraid of being seen rarely thinks to look for what's already gone." Hugh embraced the old woman quickly, awkwardly, before swinging up onto his horse. "I won't forget this, Nan. Whatever happens tomorrow, I won't forget what you risked tonight." "See that you don't," she said, swatting his leg fondly as one might a boy half his age. "And see that you tell that story properly to your own children one day, so an old woman's small courage doesn't go forgotten entirely." Edith, meanwhile, had spent those same days in growing dread, certain from Joan's silence and Hugh's sudden absence from the market cross that the match was already lost, though no formal word had come. She said as much to Joan one evening, unable to soften the truth any further.
The days of Hugh's silence were made harder still by an encounter at the market cross, where two of Simon's distant kinswomen, dressed in borrowed finery and full of borrowed grandeur, stopped Joan by the well and asked, loud enough for half the market to hear, whether she had begun sewing her own wedding gown yet, since we doubt your mother can afford a proper seamstress for such an occasion. Joan came home shaking, not from the cold, but from a shame that clung to her skin like the well water itself. "It's nothing, mother," she said, though her eyes said otherwise.
"It's nothing."
But Edith saw in her daughter's face the same wound she herself had carried since the feast, and that evening she sat a long while by the dying fire with her fists clenched in her lap, promising herself that family would not go on wounding her daughter without answering for it, sooner or later. I do not know what has happened, only that something has, and that whatever it is, we cannot fix it by wishing.
"Do you think he's changed his mind about me, mother?"
I think, Edith said carefully, that a good man does not vanish from a woman's life without cause, and Hugh Draycott has always struck me as a good man, whatever his father is. Whatever this silence is, daughter, I do not believe it is his choosing. That night, unable to sleep, Edith walked to St. Michael's Chapel alone, the same worn stone building where she had prayed once before, and knelt again before the archangel's image with his sword in his scales. "I do not ask you to make this easy," she whispered into the dark. "I have never asked for easy, not since Wilfred died and left me to raise our daughter alone.
I ask only that you not let this silence be the end of it.
Whatever is happening in that house across the river, give whoever is fighting it the strength to finish the fight." She stayed a long while, longer than she meant to, until the cold of the stone floor had worked its way into her knees and the candle beside the altar had burned low. When she finally rose to leave, she found she felt no different than when she had arrived, no sudden certainty, no sign from heaven, only the quiet, stubborn resolve to keep going one more day, which she had learned, over 20 years of widowhood, was itself a kind of answered prayer. She was right, though she would not learn how right until the following dawn, when a breathless, travel-stained Hugh appeared at her door before the sun had properly risen, old Nan's letters bundle in his coat and a look on his face that was equal parts terror and resolve. "Mistress Edith," he said, "I have something you need to see, and a debt of my own I mean to help you collect, if you will let me stand beside you when you do." Edith, reading Maud's letter by candlelight with hands that would not quite stop trembling, felt something she had not let herself feel in weeks, not merely hope, but the strange, humbling knowledge that justice, when it finally came, was arriving through the unlikeliest of doors, carried not by a stranger, but by the son of the man who had wronged her. She read the dead woman's words twice through, and found, unexpectedly, that her anger toward the Draycott name had softened at the edges, replaced by something closer to grief for a woman she had never known, who had spent her last months fighting a battle she did not live to see won. "She sounds as though she would have liked you, Mistress Edith," Hugh said quietly, watching her read. "I wish she could have known how this ends." "Perhaps she does," Edith said, folding the letter with care. "I have come to believe the dead know more of our business than we credit them for."
"Today is the eve of Michaelmas," she said finally, looking up at him.
"The fair opens at dawn tomorrow. Every trader and lord in this shire will be in the market square."
"Then that is where this ends," Hugh said.
"Not in some quiet room where my father can still buy silence, but in front of every man whose good opinion he has spent his whole life courting." Joan, who had said little through the whole exchange, watching Hugh with an expression somewhere between relief and disbelief, finally spoke. "You could have simply let him send you north, Hugh.
Waited it out. No one would have blamed you for choosing the easier road." "I thought about it," he admitted. "For most of yesterday, if I'm honest.
But I kept thinking of my mother, writing that letter to no one because she had no one else to trust with it, and I couldn't make myself become one more Draycott who let her down." Edith, watching the two of them, felt something in her chest ease for the first time in days, not because the battle was won, but because she recognized, in the way Hugh looked at her daughter, the same steady devotion Wilfred had once shown her, the kind that did not flinch even when the cost of staying became clear. The Michaelmas fair filled Hartwell's market square before the morning mist had fully lifted, stalls and pens and cloth-covered tables crowding every corner, merchants from 3 neighboring shires calling their wares beside farmers driving in the last of the autumn stock. Simon Draycott moved through it as he always did on this day, greeting fellow wool merchants with the easy confidence of a man who owned half of what was being traded, unaware that his own son stood waiting for him near the well at the square center, Edith and Joan beside him. He had spent the ride into the square rehearsing what he would say if his son had truly defied him, a stern word, perhaps, or a cold public distance that would signal to the watching merchants that whatever quarrel existed was a small, manageable thing, easily set right by a father's firm hand. None of his rehearsed words survived the sight of Edith Colfax standing beside his son, calm as still water, with Joan close at her side and Father Osric's dark robe visible at the edge of the gathering crowd. He saw them together before he understood what it meant, and something in his stomach turned cold. "Hugh," he said, approaching, his voice pitched low for the family alone, though the square was already too crowded for true privacy. "Whatever this is, it is not the place." "It is exactly the place, Father," Hugh answered, and drew Maud's letter from his coat. "You would not hear this in your own study. You will hear it here." A few heads turned nearby, a wool buyer from the next shire, a pair of farmers haggling over a pen of geese, Father Osric, who had come to bless the fair as was custom, and who now stood very still, sensing something graver unfolding than a lover's quarrel. "Read it yourself, if you doubt my word," Hugh said, holding the letter out. When Simon did not take it, Hugh unfolded it himself, and read his mother's words aloud, his voice carrying further than he intended across the stilling square, her plea, her fear, the promise extracted and never kept. His voice caught only once, on the line where his mother wrote of praying her son would not inherit his father's fear, and in that small break the whole square seemed to lean in closer, as though the crowd itself understood it was witnessing something that would be spoken of in Hartwell for years afterward, not a merchant's dispute, but a dead woman finally being heard. By the time he finished, a proper crowd had gathered, drawn by the stillness spreading outward from the well the way silence draws attention faster than any shout. Simon stood pale among his fellow merchants, men whose good opinion had cost him half a lifetime of careful charity to build. "This is a private family matter," he tried, but his voice had lost its usual command, and no one in the crowd seemed inclined to grant him the privacy he asked for. "It was private, Father, while it stayed hidden," Hugh said. "You made it a public one the night you shamed Mistress Edith before this whole shire for a poverty you yourself owed a debt toward. You cannot have it both ways." Edith stepped forward then, and from the basket on her arm drew a flitch of bacon, laying it on the nearest merchant's cloth-covered table with a gesture so simple and so strange amid the fine wool and silver coin of the fair that the crowd's murmur rose again, sharper this time. "This, Simon Draycott, is what your grandfather promised my grandfather, every year, at Michaelmas, in exchange for land my family granted his out of Christian charity, when he arrived in this shire with nothing. 21 years unpaid, and your own late wife knew it, and begged you to make it right, and you let her go to her grave believing you would." The crowd's murmur turned, unmistakably, against Simon. A wool buyer he had courted for years stepped back half a pace, as though proximity to the man had suddenly become something to avoid. Father Osric, moving through the crowd, came to stand near Edith, lending the moment the quiet authority of the church's presence without needing to say a word. Simon began, and found, for the first time in longer than he could remember, that he had no ready answer, no clever turn of phrase to right the balance back in his favor. "I did not know how to keep that promise without admitting what my family once was." He looked, in that moment, older than Edith had ever seen him, not the commanding figure who had raised his cup at the betrothal feast, but a tired man standing among neighbors he had spent decades trying to impress, discovering all at once that the impressing had cost him more than it had ever earned him. "You have known me 30 years, Alderman Fitch," Simon said, turning suddenly to the wool buyer who had stepped back from him earlier, as though searching for one friendly face in the crowd. "Surely this old business changes nothing between us." The alderman said nothing for a long moment, and his silence answered more plainly than words could have. "It changes what I thought I knew, Simon," he said finally.
"That's not nothing."
"Your family was hungry, Simon Draycott," Edith said, not unkindly.
"That is not a shame."
"The shame is spending a fortune built on someone else's charity trying to bury where it came from, instead of simply saying thank you." What followed was not the ruin some in the crowd, hungry for a merchant's fall, might have expected. Father Osric, stepping fully into the circle now, spoke the words that seemed to settle the matter in the square's collective mind more surely than any manor court could have. "We have all just heard a dead woman's last wish spoken aloud by her own son, in the middle of Michaelmas Fair," he said. "I do not think any of us need a steward's ruling to know what justice looks like here."
Edith did not ask for Simon's ruin.
"I will not claim your mill or your warehouse, Simon Draycott. I know what it is to begin again with empty hands, for so my own family once did for yours. What I ask is that you honor, at last, what your wife asked of you, and what your own grandfather promised mine, a fair acknowledgement, made publicly, and a dowry negotiated between equals from this day forward, without double demands or shame dressed up as generosity."
Father Osric added his own words then, quiet but carrying in the hushed square.
"I have known the Shire's families for 30 years, and I have heard many confessions, but few as public or as costly as the one we have just witnessed. Let it be said, from this day, that the Draycotts paid their debt not in coin alone, but in the harder currency of truth spoken aloud. That is worth more than any dowry, doubled or otherwise." Simon, before the assembled trade of 3 shires, before the son who had defied him and the woman he had humiliated, bowed his head, something none of the merchants gathered there could recall ever having seen him do, and gave his word. Joan crossed to Hugh and took his hand in front of everyone, and this time no one moved to stop them. The crowd, which had gathered for wool prices and autumn gossip and stayed for something far weightier, began slowly to disperse back into the ordinary business of the fair, though the story of what they had seen would outlast every bolt of cloth traded that day. Edith lingered a moment longer beside the merchant's table where the flitch still lay, and found Simon standing near her, uncertain, as though unsure whether he had earned the right to speak to her at all. "I do not expect your forgiveness to come easily, Mistress Edith, nor do I deserve it quickly given," he said. "I did not say it came easily," Edith answered. "Only that I am willing to give it, in time, if you prove yourself willing to earn it. That is not the same as forgetting what you did, Simon Draycott. It is only choosing not to let it govern what comes next." Simon nodded slowly, and for a moment looked as though he might say something further, but seemed to think better of it, and instead simply inclined his head to her, a small gesture, but one Edith noted was the first genuine courtesy he had ever shown her. If you have ever been judged for how little you had, with no one stopping to ask how much of your own soul you gave to keep your own with honor, then this story is, in part, yours too.
Edith found no justice in a locked archive or a formal court.
She found it in the courage of a son who chose truth over his own father's favor, and in the voice of a dead woman who had tried, even from beyond her own grave, to make right what her husband would not. May this story remind you, if ever you feel the world measures you by what you lack, that dignity is never mended with gold, but with the quiet certainty of knowing who you are, even when no one else seems to see it. And that justice, though it may wait 21 years to be spoken, always finds a voice willing to carry it at last. The fair emptied slowly around them that afternoon, merchants returning to their stalls, farmers to their pens, the ordinary business of Michaelmas resuming as though the ground itself had not just shifted beneath 3 families at once. Joan found herself laughing, unexpectedly, at nothing in particular, the strange lightness of relief bubbling up after weeks of dread, and Hugh, hearing it, thought it the finest sound he had heard in his whole life. "You did a brave thing today," she told him, as they walked together toward the edge of the square, still holding hands as though neither quite trusted the moment enough to let go. "Braver than I think I understood, watching you read that letter." "I did an overdue thing," Hugh said. There's a difference, though I confess it didn't feel like much of one this morning. Riding through the dark, half certain my father would have meant waiting to stop me at the bridge.
Would he have? Hugh considered this honestly.
A year ago, perhaps. I think, in the end, some part of him was almost relieved to have the choice taken out of his hands. It is a hard thing, carrying a secret that long. I think he had grown tired of the weight of it, even if he'd never have set it down himself. They found Edith a little apart from the dispersing crowd, still standing near the merchant's table, watching the flitch of bacon as though she could scarcely believe it had done what it had done. Joan went to her first, and the two women embraced without speaking, the kind of embrace that says more than any words could manage after a day like that one. I kept waiting for something to go wrong, Edith admitted finally, when she could trust her voice again. All the way here this morning, I kept thinking, surely this cannot be as simple as a letter and a piece of bacon. Surely there is some further trick of his left to play. There very nearly was, Hugh said. If old Nan hadn't known about the loose board, or if my father had thought to move the strongbox somewhere less familiar, I don't know that we'd be standing here at all. Then we owe her a great deal more than a place at the wedding, Edith said, and meant it so plainly that Hugh found himself oddly moved by the simple justice of it, that an old woman's small, stubborn kindness, kept alive across 2 generations of a family too frightened to use it, should turn out to matter as much as any letter or any law. Joan, watching the two of them, felt something settle in her own chest that she had not expected, not merely relief that the match was saved, but a quieter recognition that the family she was marrying into was not, after all, only the family that had shamed her mother at the feast. It was also Hugh, who had ridden through the dark for her sake, and old Nan, who had kept a promise across 8 long years, and even, in some small and unlooked-for way, Maud, whose letter had outlived her by nearly a decade to do the one thing her husband never managed, set things right. I think, Joan said slowly, that I am marrying more family than I thought I was, Mother. Not less, for all Simon Draycott's cruelty. More. Edith considered this, and found she could not entirely disagree. That is usually how it goes, in my experience. The families that wrong us and the families that redeem themselves to us are rarely as separate as we'd like to believe. Best to leave room for both possibilities in every stranger you meet, difficult as that is some days. Word of what had happened at the Michaelmas fair reached every corner of Hartwell and the neighboring villages within the week, growing a little in the telling each time it passed from one hearth to another, until by winter it had become something closer to legend than to memory. The miller's widow who brought down a wool merchant with nothing but a flitch of bacon and a dead woman's letter. Edith found the exaggerations more amusing than troubling, and corrected only the details that seemed to matter, gently insisting to anyone who asked that she had wanted no one ruined, only heard. Father Osric, for his part, began including a line in his Michaelmas sermon each year afterward, never naming names, out of a priest's discretion, but speaking always of debts owed and debts honored, of promises that outlive the ones who make them, and of the particular grace required to forgive a wrong once it has finally been brought into the light. The older women of the parish nodded along each year as though hearing it for the first time, though every one of them knew exactly whose story he meant. In the weeks before the wedding, Hugh made a point of riding out to the almshouse his father had funded over the years, the one public act of charity Simon had never fully explained even to himself, and spoke at length with its keeper, an elderly widow named Mistress Pruitt who had run the place with brisk kindness for longer than Hugh had been alive. "Your father built this place the year after your mother died," she told him, when he asked. "Never told me why, only that it should always have bread enough for anyone who came hungry to the door, no questions asked about how they came to be that way." Hugh turned this over for a long while afterward, riding home in the autumn dusk, understanding for the first time that his father's guilt had not been entirely idle in all those years of silence, that Simon had, in his own clumsy and unacknowledged way, been trying to pay a debt he could not bring himself to name directly, scattering small kindnesses like coins dropped by a man too proud to admit he owed anyone anything at all. It did not excuse the years of cruelty, Hugh decided, but it did complicate the simple portrait of villainy he might otherwise have carried of his father for the rest of his own life, and he found, somewhat to his surprise, that he was grateful for the complication. Mistress Pruitt, watching him turn to leave that afternoon, called after him with one more thing.
"There's one more matter, Master Hugh, if you've a moment. Your father asked me, every year without fail, to set aside a portion of the almshouse bread for delivery to a particular cottage near the old mill, never told me why, only that it should go quietly, without any name attached. I believe, though I never confirmed it, that the cottage belonged to Mistress Colfax." Hugh stood very still at this, working through what it meant that his father, even in the years of his cruelest pride, had been quietly feeding the very family he refused publicly to acknowledge owing anything to at all. Did she know? Mistress Edith, I mean. Did she know where the bread came from? I couldn't say, Master Hugh. Charity given in secret rarely announces its own giver, by its very nature. Perhaps she guessed. Perhaps she never thought to ask, being grateful enough simply to have it. Mistress Pruitt considered this a moment longer. Your father was not a simple man to understand, even for those of us who knew him longest. I think perhaps he did not fully understand himself, half the time. He mentioned this to Edith once, hesitantly, unsure whether it was his place to ask for any softening of her judgment on his father's behalf. I know, she said, before he had finished explaining. I have known about the almshouse for years, Hugh. I did not need your telling to understand that Simon Draycott was never quite so simple a man as his cruelty at that feast made him look. Very few people are. It does not undo what he did. It only means there was always more than one man living inside him, and it took a very long time, and a great deal of help, for the better one to finally win out. She paused, then added, more quietly than before, I knew about the bread too, Hugh, if that eases your mind any. I never let on that I knew, and I never told Joan, thinking it would only complicate a grief she was still working through. But a woman notices when bread appears at her door too regularly to be chance, and I had my suspicions from the second winter onward. I chose, in the end, to let the mystery of it be its own small kindness, rather than pick it apart looking for the giver's motives. Why didn't you ever confront him about it? You could have used it, surely proof that he knew, even then, what he owed us. I could have, Edith agreed. But some kindnesses lose their worth the moment you hold them up as evidence, Hugh. I preferred to let it simply be bread, and be grateful for it, and save my fight for the day the debt itself came due properly. I am glad, now, that the day came while I still had the strength to see it through. Joan and Hugh were wed a month later, in the small parish church, with Father Osric presiding over the ceremony. Old Nan sat in the front row in her best shawl, weeping openly through the whole service, and told anyone who would listen afterward that she had never been prouder of a boy she had nursed than she was of Hugh that day. Edith wore, by her own quiet choice, the same mended gown from the betrothal feast, though this time not a single guest in the church thought to remark on it, and those who noticed it all seemed only to think it fitting. Simon Draycott's standing among the Shire's wool merchants never fully recovered its old easy confidence. Men who had once courted his favor now watched him with the careful distance reserved for a man who had been seen, once, without his armor on. He attended the wedding regardless, standing near the back of the church in plain dress, and wept, though he tried to hide it, when Father Osric spoke Maud's name during the blessing. He did not rebuild that fortune of appearances, and in time seemed to stop trying, devoting himself instead to the quieter work of making good, in small and unannounced ways, on the debts, literal and otherwise, his family had left unpaid across the Shire for 2 generations. Hugh took over the stewardship of the wool trade within the year, and the first change he made was a standing order, posted at the counting-house door for any tenant or debtor to read, no promise made to this family, spoken or written, would ever again be allowed to die with the person who made it. He kept his mother's prayer book on the counting-house desk itself, in plain sight,
a small and deliberate reminder to himself and to anyone who did business there that some ledgers were kept by hands other than his own. Edith, for her part, did not turn the old Colfax mill into any grand undertaking. She simply had it repaired, leased it fairly to a young couple newlywed and short on means, as her own grandfather once had done for a hungry stranger, and told them, when they thanked her too many times, that the only rent she wanted was their word that they would one day do the same for someone else. Old Nan lived long enough to see Joan and Hugh's first child christened, and insisted, over everyone's mild protest, on being the one to carry the infant to the font, declaring that she had earned the privilege by keeping 2 generations of Draycott's secrets safe until the day they were finally ready to be told. She never did stop weeping happily at the smallest provocation regarding that particular grandchild, a fact the whole village found more endearing than she would ever admit to finding it herself. Maud's small childhood drawing of the mill wheel and the 2 joined names found a permanent home at last, framed simply and hung in the hall of the repaired Colfax mill, where Edith could see it whenever she passed. A reminder, she said, that some promises take decades to travel from a child's hopeful sketch to a grown woman's kept word, but that they arrive all the same, if enough people along the way refuse to let them die quietly. Alderman Fitch, the wool buyer who had stepped back from Simon in the square that Michaelmas morning, became in later years an unlikely friend to Hugh, though he never fully warmed again to Simon himself. He liked to say, whenever the story came up among the Shire's traders, that he had watched a great many men rise and fall in 40 years of the wool trade, but never one who fell so far in a single morning, and yet, in the falling, seemed finally to become someone worth knowing. Your father built a fortune on being feared a little and admired a great deal, he told Hugh once, over a cup of ale at the very fair where it had all come undone. You've built yours, young as you are, on being trusted instead. I'll wager it wears better in the long years, though I confess it's a slower road to walk. The young couple who leased the old Colfax mill from Edith, a miller's apprentice named Robert, and his new wife Sarah, who had married with even less between them than Edith and Wilfred once had, took to calling the mended millstone Mistress Edith Stone, and told the story of the flitch of bacon to anyone who asked why a woman of such modest means had chosen to charge them so little for so fine a property. Edith, hearing this secondhand, only laughed and said that stones remembered longer than people did, and it seemed only right that this one should go on being useful to somebody. Simon Draycott spent the last years of his life a quieter man than he had been for the 40 before them, and though the wool trade never again regarded him with its old easy warmth, he found, to his own quiet surprise, that he did not miss it nearly as much as he had once feared he would. He took to walking the river bank near Millhurst Croft most evenings, alone, and was seen more than once by passing tenants standing at the very spot where the old grant had first been made, though none of them ever asked him what he thought about there, and he never offered to say. He died 3 winters after the wedding, in his own bed, with Hugh at his side, and his last words, according to the servant who sat up with them both that night, were an apology, not grand, not eloquent, simply, "I should have told her myself," which Hugh took, rightly, to mean Maud, and which he never repeated to anyone but Joan, keeping it as the one truly private thing his father had ever given him. Joan and Hugh had 3 children in the years that followed, and Edith made it a habit, every Michaelmas, to gather them around the mended hearth at the old Colfax mill and tell them the story of the flitch of bacon, not as a grievance nursed and finally settled, but as a lesson in what patience and honesty could accomplish together, given enough years and enough stubbornness to see them through. The eldest, a girl with her grandmother's steady gaze and her father's quiet persistence, took to asking, every year without fail, to hear the part about old Nan and the loose board in the counting-house floor, delighting each time in the image of her staid, dignified grandfather Simon as a young husband hiding sweets from his own bride. "Tell it again, grandmother," she would say, the part where great-uncle Hugh rode through the dark not knowing if anyone would believe him. He didn't ride not knowing whether anyone would believe him, Edith always corrected gently. He rode already believing it himself. That's a different kind of brave, and the more useful kind, in the end. Remember that, all of you, the next time courage feels like waiting for permission from someone else. Old Nan did not live to see all 3 children born, but she held the first 2, and told anyone who would listen that she had now nursed, cared for, or otherwise meddled lovingly in the lives of 4 generations of 2 families who had, by her own account, taken entirely too long to realize they belonged on the same side of any argument. She was buried, at her own request, within sight of the mill, close enough to keep an eye on things, as she put it in the last clear-headed week before her final illness, and Hugh saw to it personally that a small stone was set at her grave, carved simply with her name and the words she was known for it. Years later, long after Edith herself had passed and the story had settled into the comfortable shape of a tale told at firesides rather than a wound freshly healed, travelers passing through Hartwell on Michaelmas would sometimes ask about the strange local custom of leaving a small offering of bacon at the door of the parish almshouse on the eve of the feast, a tradition begun, no one quite remembered how, by some old family settling some old debt, as the villagers would explain, with a vague and satisfied certainty of people repeating a story they had never doubted and never fully understood the particulars of, only trusting that it had been, once, a very good story indeed, and that the goodness of it had outlasted every person who had actually lived it. Many years later, when Edith was an old woman with hands still rough from work but a back still straight, a young cloth peddler passing through Hartwell stopped at the old mill, by then a gathering place for the shire's widows, and asked why so humble a building bore, above its doorway, a small carved flitch of bacon in the wood, simple as something whittled by a child with a first knife. Asked the old woman spinning by the window, one of the women there told him, nodding toward Edith. She'll tell it better than any of us could. The peddler approached, and Edith, scarcely looking up from her spinning, told him the whole story, start to finish, just as she had told it 100 times to her own grandchildren. When she finished, the young man was quiet a long while. "And you hold no grudge, Mistress Edith? After all that happened?" "A grudge is a weight a person carries alone," she answered, not pausing in her work. "Justice, though, is a weight shared with the whole shire that witnessed it. I chose to carry the second, not the first. It is a far lighter load, I promise you, even if it takes 21 years to arrive." The peddler left that same evening, but he carried the story with him to the next village, and the one after that, until, in time, no one in the shire quite remembered where it had first begun, only that it was a true story, and that it was worth the telling still.